The adaptation of the classic comic Preacher hit AMC a few weeks back, and a lot of you have been asking me to talk about it. Now, for those of you who don't know, Preacher involves the story of a preacher in a small Texas town called Annville who gets possessed by some sort of powerful spiritual entity that gives him the ability to use the word of God to make people do whatever he says. There's a lot to like with the series. There's a cool postmodern Western vibe. It's filled with fun, vibrant characters for the most part. It has a lot of nice concepts and a real interesting aesthetic. But if I'm being honest, I have mixed feelings about it. We're 3 episodes in and it feels like it's spinning its wheels already. And I think a lot of that comes from the protagonist, Jesse Custer, because I really don't know what he wants. He does a lot of that classic superhero trope of, I'm here to save the city, or in this case, it's, I'm here to save the town. But there's no real indication what that means. The town just looks like another backwater Texas town. Like, there's some crooked elements, but so far in the series, we haven't really gotten an idea of the town itself being corrupt. We also don't really know the character's relationship with God, even though he's supposed to be a preacher. There's a lot of him trying to figure out what his purpose is in the town and how he should use his power, and turning down his ex-girlfriend Tulip, who wants him to go on the heist, which I desperately want him to do because it would mean him doing something other than being a downer the whole time. Tulip is amazing and the most vibrant part of the show. Ruth Negga brings a lot of energy to her, and she's easily the most engaging part of the show for me. A close runner-up, though, is Cassidy, who's an Irish vampire that's kind of sticking around the church as a de facto handyman. This kind of chasing its own tail is unique to the show, really. In the comic, it gets off to a pretty propulsive start. Before we get too deeply in the comic, my assessment of the show is it's good. I'm waiting for it to get into another gear. It's like a B-. It has more potential that I'd like to see, and I'd like it to pick a direction and give Jesse something to do. So now, spoiler territory, we're getting into the comic. In the comic, Jesse's goal is to literally find God. Within the first few issues, we find out that God has left his throne, abandoned his throne because of the entity that has possessed Jesse, and Jesse's going to go find him to have him answer for himself and the things that he's done. So that gives Jesse a clear purpose, a clear goal, and then Cassidy and Tulip are tagging along for the ride in what becomes some sort of weird postmodern paranormal road movie. And that gives the series a lot of energy, and the first issue covers all the ground and more that we've covered in these first 3 episodes. Right off the bat, issue 1, Jesse's possessed by the entity. That act unintentionally incinerates his whole congregation, and by the end of that issue, they basically hit the road. I get the series creators' goals of kind of trying to see what Jesse was like as a preacher before all of that went down, but I always assumed that in the comic we kind of skipped over it because it was implied that he wasn't very good at it, and it was kind of boring. And now that I've seen these first few episodes of the series, that seems to prove that it wasn't all that exciting, which is why we kind of skipped over it. In that way, Preacher reminds me a lot of Gotham, where it's kind of like, oh, don't you really want to find out the backstories to all these characters before they became interesting, unique people and did interesting, unique things? And the answer is almost universally no. There's a reason the term in media res exists. Start in the middle, start as things are happening. Usually, if you start at the beginning, it takes a minute for that motor to get turned over, and it's better to hit the ground running and grip your audience right off the bat. I'm always a proponent of series that can find efficient ways to cut out the boring stuff. So I guess basically what I'm saying is that the original book was better, which that's always the thing, right? Everybody who's read the book or the source material first almost universally thinks that it is better than its adaptation. Why? Why do adaptations always suck? And I've thought about that a little bit as I've been thinking about Preacher, and like I said before, part of my problems with Preacher is that it doesn't dive into the aspects of the comic that I really enjoy. One of the most egregious offenders for me, on top of the different pacing, is the lack of the Duke, which is basically the ghost of John Wayne that haunts Jesse Custer, and Jesse's signature lighter, communism. Those two things that couldn't seem more different actually tie in together in the comic in a really kind of powerful way, and the fact that the series doesn't seem to be touching on that bums me out. And that's the thing, when you read the source material, certain aspects strike you. It's your first blush at the material, and so certain things matter to you more. And whoever's adapting it, they might have reacted to different things, and they're adapting the parts that meant something to them. And so it's not the adaptation you had in your head. They're not focusing on the parts that mattered to you, and that's okay, but it leaves you with that impression of, they're leaving important stuff out. And the truth is, it's important stuff to you, because no matter what the adaptation is, it's like translating something from one language to another. There's going to be some loss in the translation. One of the most faithful adaptations we've ever gotten of a book series is the Game of Thrones series, and if you ask any Game of Thrones fan, they'll tell you it's wildly different, even though that series is edged fairly closely to the source material, all things considered. Of course, you'll always have adaptations that are lesser than whatever the source material is, because usually if it's being adapted, it was pretty great to begin with. Take Watchmen, for example. That movie was a fairly faithful adaptation, but the original work was so nuanced and so intricate, even minor changes are missing something to the overall tone and texture and intent of the story. I don't know yet if Preacher is one of those adaptations. I don't know if Preacher is one of those things that it's inherently going to be lesser than its source material, where it's going to take a few more episodes, I think, to figure that out. They don't decide on a direction for Jesse soon, the show's going to start losing a lot of steam. I think the sooner the show finds its identity, the better. And I think that's the key to pretty much every adaptation. When the person wrote the original source material, whoever they were and whatever the material was, they had something that they wanted to say. If you're going to take the time to adapt it, you also need something to say as if it was your own material. The work either needs to be a commentary on the work being adapted or a facet of your perspective that material was the best option to adapt. On the one hand, you've got some adaptations like Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones and Harry Potter and No Country for Old Men that have done a really good job capturing the voice of the series. And on the other hand, you have an adaptation like Where the Wild Things Are that takes the elements of the story and transforms them into something deeply personal to that director. And I think all of them benefit from a strong direction and sense of purpose. And I think Preacher needs that. All right, that's it for me this week. Next week, speaking of adaptations, I'm going to be talking about Game of Thrones in anticipation of the finale. So please tweet me or let me know in the comments below your thoughts on Game of Thrones this season and what you hope to see in the finale and next season. All right, y'all have a good weekend.